The Sleep Number Smart Bed is the best bed for couples, and there's a good reason for that. Only Sleep Number Smart Beds let you choose your ideal comfort and support on your side of the bed. Firmer or softer on either side. Sleep Number does that. Perhaps you want your side cooler, and your partner wants their side warmer. Sleep Number does that too. You choose what's right for you, making it the best bed for the both of you. The Sleep Number Smart Bed will even automatically respond and adjust to your movements to help you sleep comfortably all night long. Your smart bed will even learn how you sleep and provide you personalized insights to help you sleep even better. Why choose a Sleep Number Smart Bed? So you can choose your ideal comfort on either side. And now, it's the lowest price of the season on the top-selling i8 Smart Bed. Your best savings plus special financing. Limited time. Shop a Sleep Number store near you. Sleep Number. See store or sleepnumber.com for details.
And you'll work property crimes. And then for property crimes, you may elevate yourself into crimes against persons, robbery, burglary, aggravated assault, those types of things. But at the pinnacle of your career, you're going to be working homicides. And then as a homicide detective, for the most part, you're going to be assigned to a senior homicide detective, and he's going to take the lead, and you're going to learn how to do those investigations. But by the time you get there, you will have had probably another 7-8 years of experience under your belt doing investigations, interviewing, knowing what to do, records checks, looking at everything. Unfortunately, in more rural jurisdictions or in a lot of locations in the United States where they don't deal with this level of crime, thank God, and they don't have these types of capital crimes, thank God, that they don't have the experience necessary. So you'll have a abnormal criminal behavior occur, and it may be the first homicide they've ever worked. Now, they may have been on 10 years, but they've never worked a homicide. And have a sexual assault. They've never worked one before. So we're going to make a lot of mistakes on that sexual assault, which causes a lot of problems in the prosecution. It causes a lot of problems in the investigation. They have a lot of confirmation bias. It makes them harder to prosecute, too. And prosecutors will sit back and say, well, you didn't do this right and this right and this right. Well, it isn't that they didn't want to. It's, A, they didn't have the training.
That's Scot Thomasson, a decorated former federal agent. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Scot Thomasson is a decorated former federal agent with more than 25 years of law enforcement experience. He's the founder and chief executive of Thomasson Global Consultants, a group of consultants who help create security solutions ranging from due diligence in the private sector to training federal law enforcement. Scot began his career in 1987 as a special agent in the United States Department of State's Diplomatic Security Service. DSS special agents are trained Foreign Service security professionals who do everything from advise ambassadors on security matters to work on counterterrorism cases. Scot's assignments included work at the United Nations in counterterrorism and counterintelligence, and design and management of security for U.S. facilities overseas. Scot, after 5 years, joined the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, which is known as the ATF or the BATF. He joined as a special agent and spent more than 20 years there, including holding senior posts in field divisions and at headquarters. Among the roles that Scot had was the chief of public affairs for the agency, essentially the agency's top spokesperson. In 1995, Scot received the ATF Medal of Valor, which is awarded to individuals who show acts of bravery and heroism. He's also received recognition from a number of other agencies. In his career, Scot has had a wide range of jobs, ranging from providing mobile security to serving as a sniper. Scot has a deep understanding of how the media and the criminal justice system can come together toward truth and justice, or how they can clash. His experience has brought him all over the country and the world to see the great diversity in the ways that law enforcement agencies operate and their disparity in terms of experience and resources. Scot and I also both grew up with journalism in our bones and spent formidable years in the Washington, D.C. area. And many of the great journalists who I read in the Washington Post, who were on the nightly news and later became either my colleagues or my competitors, sat around his dinner table. From Moscow, Idaho, to Delphi, Indiana, to Boulder, Colorado, many law enforcement agencies have struggled to handle high-profile, complex cases, while many major areas like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, where the experience and expertise exist, a sense of apathy has emerged. Today, we're going to discuss the challenges of solving crimes in more urban and rural areas and some of the solutions that Scot is a part of building to close some of those gaps. And we're also going to talk about some of the mindset shifts that Scot feels will make a real difference. Hey, Scot. So I just wanted to thank you for coming on today. I was really excited to hear the interview that you gave with Kevin Greenlee and Anya Kane on the murder sheet. And just in listening to some of the things that you were talking about the, related to, I think, not just the challenges, but some of the potential solutions for law enforcement, I thought it would be really wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to you. And then to find out at the same time that you also grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, you sat at the table of a lot of really, really cool journalists who at different points I either worked with or competed against. I just thought that was really cool, and I'm great that we can have this conversation.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, Jason. It was amazing. If you grew up in the Northern Virginia area or the Washington metropolitan area, how small a world it is, and the connections either directly or indirectly you have with a variety of different people, especially when you meld it down into law enforcement and journalism. There's a lot of connections.
Yeah, it's so true. It's funny too, because you think it's a big, vast metropolis that runs from, Baltimore to way out into the sort of edges of Virginia, but it really is a small world. I always feel maybe like 2 hops away from most people here.
It is, and I think what people tend to forget is back when we grew up. I'm not throwing in the same mix with me and age, but when we grew up, it was really a conglomeration of a lot of small towns, which were the suburbs for Washington, D.C. And there was a lot more space in between each little town. So there were a lot of people that I knew came from where I grew up in Annandale to were over, that I knew people over in Springfield and Oakland and Oakton and Tysons and Towson up in Maryland and Montgomery County and all over.
Yeah. In a weird way, without so many people, we ended up being closer together. There were times where I went to high school 10 years before was just nothing but fields. But, a lot of people will come to Northern Virginia, go to a place like Tyson's, and, it's filled with malls and the Galleria and all these other things. And I'm like, first time I was around here, that was like fields with horses and
Right.
other items. A very different Washington, D.C., but still in so many ways the same. So, one of the things that I was really curious about, and I have this tendency to want to dive into it. Your law enforcement background is so fascinating to me. But I also feel like an important part of sort of any conversation like this is sort of who you are as a person. And I'm just really sort of curious about like what it was like for you growing up. How you eventually, coming from the background and the family you had, found yourself on a path toward law enforcement even.
Well, yeah, no, it's so my father was a investigative reporter, a journalist, I worked for the E.W. Scripps Company and became the vice president of news for E.W. Scripps. And there was one thing, one profession that he absolutely forbid me from going into, and that was journalism. It was over his dead body. Was I going to be allowed to go into journalism? So I actually played college football and then came back to Northern Virginia and was coaching at the high school level for a couple of high schools in Springfield, Virginia, and West Springfield High School and Lake Braddock High School. And I actually got recruited into the State Department. I had some friends of his started contacting me and wanting me to go to lunch. I started meeting various people, and I actually was recruited into that line of work. Now, at the time, federal law enforcement wasn't really hiring, but after about a year of meeting various people or whatnot, I found that I began working at the State Department.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't even realize that the State Department is a potential option for law enforcement. I know from, obviously being in the DC area, I found out a little bit about the State Department's Intelligence Bureau and the Diplomatic Security Service. I found out a lot more about them when I was in New York, actually, with the United Nations and all the diplomatic missions and events that occur. What does the State Department do when it comes to law enforcement?
Well, it actually has it has a broad-based variety of responsibilities. On the law enforcement side, it's responsible for passport and visa fraud. It handles identity theft and addresses international identity theft and smuggling and concealing your identity. Also, anti-terrorism on the overseas side, on the law enforcement side, it is the primary agency that handles anti-terrorism and counterintelligence with regard to its facilities around the world, U.S. facilities around the world. It has an intelligence piece to it where it does a lot of counterintelligence and works as a member of the intelligence community. Also on the law enforcement side, they do protection. A lot of people don't realize this, but the State Department has a broader and greater authority to protect foreign dignitaries than the Secret Service. Secret Service is charged with protecting the president, the vice president, their families. State Department is charged with protecting all foreign dignitaries as they come into the United States, and then also all U.S. personnel overseas. What happens is through a memorandum of an agreement or understanding on a yearly basis, the State Department delegates some of its authority for the foreign heads of state to the Secret Service and actually takes some of its budget and pushes it over to the Secret Service's budget. And then the State Department takes all number twos of those countries and all the way down. So it has a specific responsibility of protecting the lives of foreign dignitaries as they visit the United States. So, between the criminal investigations, the counterintelligence work, the protective work, the physical security work, they're responsible for all physical security of U.S. facilities overseas, non-military facilities overseas. That's a pretty broad-based mission.
Yeah. Are most of the people who go into that work former law enforcement, or are they similar paths to yours? How do you?
No, that's an interesting question. Actually, no. Most of the people who go into that line, because they recruit very heavily, they have a lot of military personnel that go into that line of work, but they really try to stay away from the law enforcement, prior law enforcement, to go into that type of work because it takes a different type of person, and oftentimes you're operating by yourself in a foreign land, foreign country. There is no backup. Oftentimes, you'll go out 3, 6, 8, 12 months by yourself with a specific mission set. Sometimes you might be paired up with a person or 2 people or 3 people. They might be from other agencies. They might be from other military units, but essentially, you're kind of a lone operator out there conducting the government's work or business.
And I also imagine, I didn't even think about the idea of isolation, but I also imagine, kind of like in thinking about how the Green Berets have to be different in the Army, that you have to probably be pretty culturally aware. That's got to be an important part, because I imagine if you're working for the Diplomatic Security Service, whether you're doing protection or you're working overseas, there's probably, and all of this is somehow intersecting with Americans. You've got to be able to code switch pretty easily from cultures. And
Absolutely. In fact, it's kind of interesting that, one of the test questions at the initial interview phase, was what are the top two crops that are grown in arid climates, and what have I applied for? But they really want you to be culturally aware, and also you have to have a great understanding of what's going on in the world, where the hotspots are, what are the driving factors of each section of the country, and how does it play out from one minute to the next, and how are they intersect with each other.
Oh, that's neat. And so you spent it was your first 5.5 years, do I have that right, at working for Diplomatic Security Service, both overseas and domestically. And then at that point, you made the decision to move over to the ATF. How did that come about? How did that transition?
Well, I spent, yes, that's right. So I spent the first 5.5 years worked for the State Department. In fact, I actually was assigned overseas immediately, and spent the first 2.5 years living in Central and South America.
Wow.
And working in Central and South America. And I have to realize that was a time before cell phones, before the internet, before emails. There were no radios. You essentially operated by yourself, or I operated by myself for about 2.5 years in Central and South America. And this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And then I came back working with the State Department, and did a lot of dignitary protection, high threat protection, where they were going to, there was credible threats they were going to assassinate somebody. And then the job was to keep them alive, and then did work with some other units, and then traveled throughout all of Latin America for the most part on a regular basis. And in my last year, I think I was home 5 days out of the year. I think the previous year I was maybe home 10 days out of the whole year, and it was like a Wednesday here and a Thursday there. I spent the first 5 years, I was home for Christmas 2 years, missed Thanksgiving, birthdays, holidays, weddings, all that good stuff. So you're on the road a lot. And after about 5.5 years, I really kind of wanted to start working more criminal investigations than the intelligence work that I was doing. And so I applied to ATF, and was hired. And I was actually in South America when they called and offered me the job. And I'm sitting in a third world country in South America, and they said, "Would you like to go to Colorado Springs?" And I was like, "Absolutely."
Yeah. How quickly can you get me there?
It's kind of like, well, that was a no-brainer.
And the ATF is an interesting agency too. Over time, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, explosives, all the things, all things that go boom, as I like to say.
Mm-hmm.
All they have to do is throw the drug enforcement agency in there, and then you got all the troubled stuff really
Right.
all connected together. What is the ATF's remit, and what's it like to be an agent there?
Well, what I do is, when I speak to, let me explain it this way. When I speak to college students, and especially those who are interested in going to law enforcement, I always tell them to be introspective and figure out what is a driving force for them. Are they the type of a person who is very linear. They need a very structured environment. Go to step one, and then wait for instructions. Go to step two, wait for instructions. Go to step three, wait for instructions. And they need that structured environment. Or there's somebody who just needs a goal line, get there, and then with a structured environment, they feel like they're suffocating. And so they're more of a free thinking kind of, I'll figure it out as I go, and just kind of
sort of like your process structure people versus your really flexible, tolerant of ambiguity crowd.
Correct. And that's important, because if you are a free thinker and you're stuck in a structured environment, then what happens is, if you're a free thinker and you're stuck in a structured environment, you're seen as a loose cannon. You don't get along with people. You're not going to get promoted. They think that you're out of control. You're a wild cowboy. And if vice versa, if you're in a free thinking kind of, make your own bones, make your own cases, and you need that structure, you're seen as very linear, very, very one-dimensional, and not very intelligent. So I actually give that advice to colleges, but I actually took it myself, and I was succeeding very greatly. I did very well in the State Department, and the State Department is that free thinking. Here's a mission statement. Go for the next 18, 24 months, whatever the assignment, and just make it happen. You don't have to report back, just make it happen. And there are certain agencies that also have that cultural type of play in it. And DEA, ATF, CIA, those are the three. And so because of that,
here's the goalpost, get there.
Get there, that's it. We don't care if you run, we don't care if you pass, we don't care if we don't care how you get there.
You crawl under the field.
Whatever. We don't care how you get there, just get there. And so consequently, I applied to ATF, and knowing that was the type of culture that I succeeded in, and and was worked out well in. So being an ATF agent was really kind of interesting, because it was go find the bad guys, go find the worst of the worst that you can find, the people who are committing the worst crimes in your area of responsibility, and do undercover, find informants, do surveillance. You figure it out, but find enough evidence that you can prosecute them in federal district court and get them off the street. And that's how it was. And so I was in control of my own cases. I started them. I picked them. I started them. I did, all my own undercover, with the exception of a couple of cases. I was a case agent. So you got to control it. And then when you went to court, you carried it all the way through the trial process.
Yeah, it feels very, from what you're describing, very sort of like you're the player and the coach, or you're the writer and the editor, unlike a place like the FBI where things are very, very, very structured. Or much more structured.
Absolutely, very structured. I worked cases by myself. There wasn't a team of us. I had a partner when I worked the street for a period of time. Basically, he worked his cases, I worked my cases, but we helped each other out. So, everything I did, he was doing. Everything he did, I was doing. But we had our own cases. But you're pretty much on your own. It's like it's kind of like being an investigative journalist, right? Go out and make your bones. Find if you're working politics, you're working crime, you're working. You go out and work your sources, have informants. So.
Yeah, as we used to say in the newsroom, your job is hunt, kill, right? Bring it back.
Right? That's right. That's right.
And don't get in trouble, of course. Right. So it must be interesting on some levels, because I think of like the difference between going off to your first job in a large corporation where you have like a small piece of the pie and you do this narrow thing and you don't always see how it interconnects, versus sort of like something like running a small business where you're doing a little of this, a little of that, a little of all this. It sounds like your work initially at the ATF is a bit more like the small business. You're touching every aspect of it, learning every aspect of it. Do you think that gives you a broader perspective to some extent, or people who do that for some period in their I guess earlier in your career, you're able to get a little bit broader perspective of how everything connects?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, listen, I think there's significant value to working in a general group where you're not just working arson, you're not just working guns, you're not just working tobacco cases, you're working anything that comes down the pike. And, everything I did, I worked, everything, as you mentioned earlier, was connected to drugs somehow. So we would partner up with DEA just about on every case. We would partner up with state and locals. And so on any given week, you're working a bombing, you're working an arson, you're working a homicide, you're working a theft from a gun store, you're working a couple of drug cases. And then you have to be, what I used to do is, at the conclusion of every trial, I would sit down, and I had 100% prosecution rate. I had 100% conviction rate. I had 100% acceptance rate. Every case I brought was accepted. I actually had probable cause authority, which nobody else in the state, at least with ATF, had. I could arrest somebody on probable cause right then and there, and then call the U.S. attorney the next day and say, "Hey, I just put this guy up. Here's the paper." And
that's a trust thing with the U.S. attorney, right? The U.S. attorney trusts you enough.
Yeah.
And when you would say acceptance rate, 100% acceptance, you mean that the prosecutors are accepting the case?
That's what I'm saying. Every case I referred to the U.S. attorney's office was accepted for prosecution. And so what happens is you're able to work all those different cases. But what I used to do is at the conclusion of a case, I'd sit down and I'd go through a hot wash. I would look at everything I did, how I did it in the most infinite details, and figure out what I did good, what I did bad, what I could do better. And then the next case, I would make those adjustments. So, and as little things as if I was undercover and tape recording a conversation, how do I put the leader on the tape? Do you put it at the beginning or the end? What information do you put? I was very, very anal about the very small, minute details of putting my case together. So consequently, you get better each time, and better and better and better and better, until it becomes second nature.
It actually brings me to something that, you had mentioned that you had the chance to work with lots of different federal law enforcement agencies, state, local law enforcement. And, just what you were saying there about every time you had a chance to do it, you got better and better. I've been thinking about this broader issue of local law enforcement in general. A case that comes to mind, you were in Colorado Springs, but the JonBenet Ramsey case comes to mind when I think of this. The murders in Delphi, Indiana, of Abby Williams and Libby Germain come to mind. But even the University of Idaho murders in Musco, Idaho, or you pick these big, high-profile murders that happen in smaller communities where they do not have a lot of experience doing those things. And when I say experience, I don't just mean law enforcement doesn't. The communities don't have, and these become very big events that, in my mind, if I were sitting in New York City, they would still be big events, but they would not be big like this. And I was recently listening to the prosecutor in the Delphi murders in Indiana, and in his closing argument, part of what he said, he's a guy named Nick McClelland, but he said that when they were searching for the girls, for Abby and Libby, on the first day when they went missing, that no one suspected that there was any malfeasance. And another quote that he said was that, no one was looking for two dead bodies. And then the quote that got me and kind of like crystallized it, he said, "This doesn't happen around here. small communities, these things don't happen. And I look at what happened with that investigation, where there were a lot of mistakes that I think, any investigation is going to have mistakes in it. Let's not kid ourselves. But I think a lot of mistakes that wouldn't have necessarily happened if it was in Chicago or New York, because they've done 100 of these, or they've done, whatever it is. And I just wonder whether there is a challenge there for local law enforcement who don't get the chance to do what you were just saying, which is repeating these big cases over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point you're making. So what happens is this, is a lot of people tend to forget that law enforcement is a bit of an apprenticeship, okay? Look, what I said earlier about I'd review my cases after each one, let's make no mistake. I was making mistakes, lots of mistakes, okay? But unless you're willing to address your mistakes, learn from your mistakes, and then make sure you don't make that mistake again and improve on it, you never get any better. And everybody, you're right, everybody does make mistakes. But when it comes to investigations, it's a bit of an apprenticeship. And the more investigations you do, the better you are. The more interviews you do, the better you get as an interviewer. The more you educate yourself and learn different techniques. The biggest fallacy, not fallacy, but the biggest problem in especially in death investigations is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is the focus on one conclusion to the exclusion of everything else. And you tend to stake your reputation on. And I see a lot of confirmation bias around the country. And that's very normal for inexperienced investigators. In fact, I would probably tell you the more inexperienced investigator, the greater you have to fight confirmation bias, because they tend to stake their reputation on it. But law enforcement's an apprenticeship. And so if you were in New York City, if you're in Chicago, if you're in Miami, and you're a promising young police officer and you really got it going on, you'll probably work the street 5, maybe 10 years, and then you'll move into property crimes. And you'll work property crimes. And then for property crimes, you may elevate yourself into crimes against persons, robbery, burglary, aggravated assault, those types of things. But at the pinnacle of your career, you're going to be working homicides. And then as a homicide detective, for the most part, you're going to be assigned to a senior homicide detective, and he's going to take the lead, and you're going to learn how to do those investigations. But by the time you get there, you will have had probably another 7-8 years of experience under your belt doing investigations, interviewing, knowing what to do, records checks, looking at everything. Unfortunately, in more rural jurisdictions or in a lot of locations in the United States where they don't deal with this level of crime, thank God, and they don't have these types of capital crimes, thank God, that they don't have the experience necessary. So we'll have a abnormal, apparent criminal behavior occur, and it may be the first homicide they've ever worked. Now, they may have been on 10 years, but they've never worked a homicide. They have a sexual assault. They've never worked one before. So we're going to make a lot of mistakes on that sexual assault, which causes a lot of problems in the prosecution. It causes a lot of problems in the investigation. They have a lot of confirmation bias. It makes them harder to prosecute, too. And prosecutors will sit back and say, well, you didn't do this right and this right and this right. Well, it isn't that they didn't want to. It's A, they didn't have the training, and B, they didn't have the apprenticeship, the experience, the time doing the job, sitting in the chair and learning from your mistakes.
That's interesting. I was sort of surprised at first, but now after listening to you, it makes sense. I was surprised that you were saying that one of the real biggest challenges among people who are inexperienced in law enforcement is that confirmation bias. But something clicked as you were talking. And I was thinking to myself, just kind of imagining in a smaller town with a smaller law enforcement department, or even, might even be tiny, might be mid-sized. But to your community, you are the experts in this area. They are looking to you.
That's right. Yep.
And so you probably have this different kind of pressure to quickly sort of interpret the information in front of you and come up with something. And inevitably, our first blush at something is going to sort of conform to our existing beliefs. And it can really be hard to let go of those things. And whether that existing belief is the seminar from that I just went to, or take something like Delphi, that a monster must have done this, or take something like JonBenet in Boulder, which, she was murdered in the basement of the house. It's most likely the parents, right? You're going to that default reaction. And as the local expert, it's harder to let go of it. Because one of the things, it's funny, when you said that, I think of some of my favorite investigators that I personally know, and we'll talk about true crime cases, and I'll give them some new fact. They'll have a clear position, and I'll give them some new fact they didn't know, and they will literally turn their position around so comfortably without any anxiety about it. And that I never really thought of that.
Yeah, and that's part of it. You're dead spot on, Jason. And that's part of the problem with confirmation bias, and that's the hardest thing to beat is the fact that people not only focus on a set of facts to the exclusion of everything else, but they stake their reputation on it, because there's tremendous amount of pressure in a small community to solve the crime, to be the hero, to figure it out. After all, what are they paying you for? But to protect them. And then when you don't protect them, you have to go out and find resolution to this. You have to find justice. And so the pressure's on you. And it may be your first homicide, maybe your first sexual assault that you're working. But at the end of the day, it becomes a reputational issue for them. And I've seen people stand by a set of facts that anybody else in America would say they didn't do it. And yet they'll still to this day say, no, they absolutely did. And when it defies our logic. And we'll make illogical arguments. The best one is you can't be at two places at the same time, right? If a guy's got an alibi and his alibi locks him up across town, why are you still focused on him, right? He didn't do it, but yet they'll say, well, he had to have found a way, and it just defies logic. So confirmation bias, and it kind of brings up another issue, and the other issue is why is it that certain cases draw national attention, why others don't? And that has a lot to do with the communities in which they occur, and the level of crime, which are a normal level for that community. If you have a community where there's little to no crime, and then there's a double, triple homicide, that's a big deal. Where as opposed to, you're in Southeast DC over in Anacostia, and there's a double, triple murder on a Friday night, and it's like, oh, okay, we'll work this one on top of the one that occurred Thursday night and one that occurs on Saturday night. It just happens on a regular basis. So.
Right. And the mentality toward it, it could be, I could see that when I was reporting in New York, even, but depending on what neighborhood it happened in, but even the ones that happened in neighborhoods, like a nice neighborhood in New York or a nice place, there's a double homicide, resources would get thrown at it. But it was really interesting to watch compared to some others that I've covered in more local or smaller localities. A ton of resources could get thrown at a case that was a red ball and it was burning on fire. But these guys and women all knew each other. They had done this together before. There was this sort of like comfort in bringing all these resources to bear. And I think for a lot of these local organizations, you've got your neighbor police departments helping out. You may have to call the FBI. You may have the marshals coming in, the ATF coming in, and you may on paper have the same number of bodies, but you don't have the same experience, if that makes sense, or the decision makers aren't. It becomes really difficult to try and replicate that on a local level, if that makes sense.
It does, and listen, we are currently going through a period in our resolving crime and clearance rates. Clearance rates have dropped significantly. They're down. Clearance rates for a long time were about 62% clearance rates, and in the past 7 to 10 years, they've dropped 16% to 52%. So only 5 out of 10 homicides get cleared. There's 21,000 average homicides a year, so 10,000 a year aren't getting cleared. There's 350,000 unsolved homicides currently. We have violent crime, which is ag assault, robbery, burglary, sexual assault, and there's anywhere from 7 to 10 million of those being occurring or that are unsolved, I should say, that are unsolved. And the clearance rate for ag assault has dropped 25%. The clearance rate for rape has dropped 34%. And so what you're seeing on a national average is a significant decrease in law enforcement's ability to close cases, to bring people to justice.
It's interesting. One of the most striking numbers around that, that I've seen recently, and I'm not going to get it word for word, but David Cime, the writer of Homicide: Life on the Street, the television show, and then also The Wire, right? He, I think it was last summer, he tweeted that the clearance rate in Baltimore had dropped to 13%.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that they've only solved like a handful of domestic murders,
Yeah.
like the ones that are caught on videotape, the ones where the guy walks in and says it, the ones where the cop is standing right beside them and it happens.
Whether the staff did it and she's still standing over the body with their gun, smoking.
Right.
Yeah.
And his tweet was, they've basically made murder legal in Baltimore. And I thought to myself, wow, that's crazy. 13%. I remember when I was covering, it was like 60 plus or above in Baltimore.
Yes. So what's happened, and this is something I always try to point out to people is
you would think though with DNA and other things like that, wouldn't the number be going in the opposite direction?
No. And right now it's at 52%. Okay. And so what you have to do is consider the statistics, and the statistics say, all right, if it's 52% of the homicides, that's not too bad. Well, it is, because it's down 16%. But here's the part the part that people don't consider is that's a national average. So you have, let's just say Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they have a homicide rate of 20 per year, and they solve all 20. Well, that's 100%. And then you go to Baltimore, where it's 13%, and so it averages out to 52. I can tell you now, Flint, Michigan, 17% solve clearance rate, 17%. So you have a great disparity. You have some that have.
Scott, if I invite you to Flint, Michigan for no good reason, look out.
I have no good reason to go to Flint. So,
right.
but what you do is you have locations that don't have very many homicides, and they're able to solve them because they're domestic related or they're really kind of no brainers. And then you have these cities, Chicago, Flint, Michigan, Baltimore, Philadelphia, some of these other locations where they can't catch a break, and they're constantly way below the national average. They're at 15, 20, 25% solve rate. So,
yeah. And what do you think makes the difference? Is it deeper than just law enforcement itself?
No, I think what happens is it's a combination of things. So you have, we talked a little bit earlier about it, having an apprenticeship, right? So what's happened is that whole system has been turned on its ear in a lot of jurisdictions, with the exception of like New York City or Chicago or some of these other places. And that's happened because you have early retirement. So you have your heavy experience, which is walking out the door. Two is you have a profession which is not in high regard within the community, so they're having a hard time recruiting people. Three is they're having to promote people way above their way above what they should be in time wise, and they've had to reduce some of the training, so they're not getting the training that they need. So it's a multitude of combinations: lack of experience, lack of mentorship, having to promote people before they're ready to be promoted or should be promoted. And people kind of being thrown into the mix without the right type of training and interviewing and some of the other skill craft that's necessary to solve a crime. And I think that's having a significant impact on it.
I read.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh no, I read a recent story. It was around the time of the pandemic, so maybe not that recent now, but it was about the LA's robbery homicide unit, where they had made the decision to reduce the size of the unit essentially through attrition because the murder rate had gone down. And, I think LA's robbery homicide unit came out of, I forget which set of murders it was, but it was a high profile set of murders in LA in the 60s or something along those lines. But the idea was we need to build knowledge among a bunch of investigators here. And one of the unintended consequences, it wasn't like, okay, our murders have gone down 20%. Let's reduce the homicide unit by 20%. What they found was that if they did that, you lost institutional knowledge that made it harder to close. So you were actually, if you cut the wrong people or you let the wrong people go, you were actually, even though percentage-wise the unit was matching the homicide rate, knowledge-wise, it was actually dropping much further. And that, just what you were saying made me think of that.
Yeah, and what also happens is, and this is a big part of it, is they've increased the threshold. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of jurisdictions that won't respond if it's a burglary. So the threshold for what they will respond to is significantly higher. If it's a robbery and there's no gun involved, sometimes they won't respond. You come fill out a report. Burglary, and there's nobody home, you come fill out a report. Well, what you're doing is you're leaving a ton of evidence behind. And when you do that, you're kind of saying we're not going to work those crimes. Well, the reality is the guy who's committing murder today was committing robbery and burglary yesterday and the days before that, will commit another murder and maybe a sexual assault. So you have a whole bunch of crimes, some of which aren't even being investigated. Some aren't even being compared to each other, that are being committed by a few number of individuals. And if you can target, identify, and then remove those individuals from the community, you can definitely affect violent crime. And that's really what this is about. How do you affect violent crime? And how do you solve unsolved violent crime and cold case homicides? Because all those victims and all those families, whether it's an ag assault, a sexual assault, a murder, deserve a full court press on finding justice for them.
That advice you gave, it reminds me of a guy I grew up with. He went off to work for the Air Force's Special Investigations Group. That basically their equivalent of the MPs. And he said that the lesson he learned when it came to riot control was that when there was a riot, you didn't take on the rioters. You spent a minute figuring out who was really leading the rioters, and you just took that guy out. And that's like the idea of being smart or strategic about crime. Like if you recognize that a small segment of people are responsible for a ton of crime, or their criminal acts are leading to more crime, that if you target it smartly, kind of like you were talking about, your ATF bosses said, go find the biggest, the baddest, the worst, it can be very helpful. But jumping back into the shoes of that person in local law enforcement that doesn't have that experience and that history that we're talking about in certain jurisdictions or at a federal agency, what are the options for that sheriff or that local police department leader or detective right now, when it comes to that moment where someone like JonBenet Ramsey is found in the basement, or Abby and Liddy are killed in the park? What can they turn to?
Well, they've got so first and foremost is there's plenty of assistance from neighboring departments that can lend a hand with that. But in particular, we have created a generative AI product that will take the best police practices and apply them to every investigation, whether it's a current investigation or a cold case or unsolved violent crime, and basically be Sherlock Holmes in a box, Dick Tracy in a box. This generative AI product will actually front load all the investigative best practices and will address confirmation bias and is evidence-based system, and will help lead and direct an investigator to a successful conclusion. It'll supply here's some people you need to look at. Here's some suspects. Here's some vehicles. Here's who the victim is and their affiliation with potential targets. Here's electronic evidence. Here's DNA evidence, and it will actually go through the investigation and steer a inexperienced or an experienced investigator to a successful conclusion, and then works with the prosecutors to work with them to make sure that the right person has been investigated and referred for prosecution.
And so when you're sort of like thinking about or talking about generative AI, most people are, I think, if they're familiar with it at all, they're familiar with like large language models like ChatGPT, where, it's basically this statistical model of joint probability. You're looking at, you might be looking at this sort of observable variable, the largest variable, and based on my question or my concern, you're using your large language model to give me the right answer. But I imagine it's a very important part of, let's say, using generative artificial intelligence in law enforcement is that your AI model is based on really solid, reliable data. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's and you know a lot about this stuff. So what we do is we're utilizing multiple AI type of processes. Okay, so we're using generative, we're using large language models, we're using neural networks, and we are front loading the best police practices. These are the types of police practices that are being taught and have been taught around the world and continue to be taught as the ways to conduct investigations. And then we're backing that up with kind of a proprietary way of validating and ensuring that all the proper dots are being collected or connected, I should say, and there's a whole validation system. But more importantly, we're also loading up things like the Medicological book, which is the book that is used for medical examiners. So all of that information has been loaded up. We have loaded up a vast amount of reference material that is used not only in the medical community, but investigations, out of ballistics, out of all the various forensic sciences have all been loaded up into the system itself that's constantly bouncing itself off of. We believe that we can actually, and where we're starting is bring some solace to a lot of these unsolved violent crimes and cold case homicides. We believe that that we should be able to solve a very large portion of them, And then when we move into the proactive phase, make sure that most cases are resolved in a timely fashion and are not going cold and are not sitting there collecting dust in the back of the file.
It's interesting because the way that you're describing it, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but it sounds like you're talking about taking a generative approach where you can sort of have that probability distribution, but ultimately taking it to the point where you can have a more discriminative model where you can essentially say, hey, given observation X, I can now discriminate and say it's most likely a Y, right? Or that it could be Y or Z or whatever. But so it would basically be a giant investigative support tool, because that's kind of what happens in investigative support.
Correct. So imagine, let me give you a great analogy here. So imagine that you're a brand new, you're in, let's just say you're in Salem, Virginia, and you are a brand new, minted detective of the Salem Police Department. And you've never really done an investigation. You pushed a squad car around for about 5 years. You're a smart guy. You have a college degree. You're dedicated. And you come across your first homicide or your first sexual assault or your first rape or your first aggravated assault. You'll be able to take this system, employ it, and then all of a sudden, it's like you've got a seasoned investigator in front of you saying, hey, you need to go interview these 4 people. Hey, you need to pay attention to this vehicle, and here's why. Hey, these residences need to be worked at. No, yeah, you want to do a search warrant? Here's your probable cause to do a search warrant. Here's your probable cause to do an arrest warrant. Your victim was associated with this organization and was a known drug dealer, or your victim was a sex offender 3 counties over. And it's going to be able to front load all that information for you in seconds. And then you, as that investigator, it's like having Sherlock Holmes as your mentor, and then you just take it and move forward with it.
So it's even, it reminds me, like, in some ways of what, thinking of other investigative support, in a way, attorneys, right? The prosecutors provide support to investigators. Hey, this is what you need for probable cause. Like, this would work, this wouldn't. Or you get something like the FBI's behavioral analysis unit that says, hey, you should prioritize this suspect because of this. It's sort of like packing a lot of those investigative support tools into an easy to use and access
mobile platform. Right. Well, now here's a little bit different. Now, we're not putting any of the profiling or the FBI behavioral science stuff anywhere near this, okay? Because it's not evidence-based, it's opinion, and it's
frankly, most people in the behavioral analysis unit would tell you were insane if you did it.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's the most over dramatized part of an investigation you can have, and honestly, it'll take you down rabbit holes that you don't need to be going down. This is 100%. This is 100% evidence based. It ties with the DNA. So let's just take a case real quick. Let's say we go to Baltimore, okay, and let's say Baltimore says, hey, we've got 1,000 unsolved homicides, cold case homicides. By the way, we've got 8,000 unsolved aggravated assault, sexual assault, armed robberies, okay, violent crime. We have 8,000 unsolved violent crimes, and we've got 1,000 cold case homicides. What we're going to do, we're going to go in, and we're going to go through. We're going to use this platform, these suite of products, and we're going to go through, and we're going to take every case, and we're going to provide a list of this what needs to be done. Hey, you didn't send this to the lab to get a fingerprint. Send it to the lab. Hey, you sent these fingerprints. You've never got a result. Hey, this DNA, you've got DNA here, but you never submitted it for a DNA report. Why not? And it's going to give you a list of everything that you need to do on every case. 1. 2, it's then going to compare every case against every other unsolved case and say, whoa, this ag assault and this ag assault and this sexual assault and this homicide are all connected, and here's how they're connected. Common vehicle, common license plate, common suspect. Then it's going to take that and it's going to bounce it off your historical data. Oh, this license plate here, that was actually used in a drive-by shooting in which the suspects were arrested. Here are the suspects. And it's going to then compare that. And then finally, it's going to provide you with what's called a solvability matrix. It's the eSleuth solvability matrix. This is called eSleuth AI. And eSleuth AI is the product, and the solvability matrix is a list of every investigation that it's just reviewed, it's just curated, and it says, go work on these cases first because you have a better chance of solving those fast. Work on these cases second. And what it does is prioritize your workload. It tells you, hey, go investigate these cases. And oh yeah, by the way, here's what you need to get done, and here's how you need to investigate them, and here's what you need to do to get to a conclusion. And then after you're done with all those, go to these, because your higher probability of solving the first tier and the second tier is far greater than the third tier. And what happens is, as an investigator, you're looking at, what do we say, 9,000 cases? Now, that doesn't count all the cases that are continually coming in. That's if you put a pin in it and stopped all investigations coming in and you were just looking at cold cases. And what it does is you just reach in and start working them. You have no clue whether you're working a dead-end case or not, and you could spend a year on it. What this does is prioritize the work, get a greater success rate, greater conclusion rate, and actually it will increase the clearance rate for crime significantly.
Do you, in terms of adoption of something like this, what do you see the challenges as being?
Honestly, I don't see any challenge. I cannot imagine why any department would not want this type of service. What happens is, and what's interesting is this, is, and you know this, police department leadership changes with the wind. Okay, chiefs come and go, sheriff come and go. And they have a tendency to say, okay, I'm only responsible for what happens under my watch. So, for instance, if you're in Baltimore and you're the new chief of police, all those prior crimes that were committed and are unsolved, you may not look at them as a priority because they didn't occur under your watch. That was somebody else's problem, not yours. I say, not true. You're a law enforcement professional, and you have a responsibility to solve all crime of your jurisdiction, whether it happened yesterday, last year, last month, 10 years ago. If you can solve it, you should. And so what happens is they tend to put very little to no resources towards solving old crimes. I will tell you now, I've been doing this a long time. If an agency, pick a city, decided, this is what we want to do, I am telling you that this technique, this approach, this product, eSleuth.ai, will reduce violent crime, because when you solve yesterday's unsolved crimes, you're affecting tomorrow's crime rate, because it's the same people committing the crimes. When you can solve those unsolved crimes from yesterday, you are reducing tomorrow's crime rate, and it's going to drop precipitously across the board.
One of the things I wanted to ask, just as thinking about what you're saying, is sort of like another side of the coin. I guess the other side of the coin is, if you look at this as a tool that's helping prioritize law enforcement, energy, resources, and attention, it's easy to look at that just simply through the lens of like solving cases. But also, I imagine thinking of it from a resource perspective, but also the lives of the people who are involved, whether it's victims' families or suspects or whoever, that it could also help prioritize to keep you out of rabbit holes. And I know there's a lot of debate, like in cases like whether John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey were a rabbit hole, but I think a more easy one that I think we could almost all agree on is a Richard Jewell, for example,
Oh, yeah.
the 1996 Atlanta bombings, that there could be this other flip side to it, more human flip side to it, of not going down as many rabbit holes where, when there's an investigation, people have no idea, even when ultimately it seems pretty clear who the person is. A lot of people get bumped along the way, and their lives get destroyed.
Absolutely. That goes toward confirmation bias. I mean, Richard Jewell is 100% confirmation bias. ATF knew Richard Jewell didn't do it and was looking at Eric Rudolph from the very beginning. It wasn't only the Olympic Park bombing, but it was the Other Side Lounge bombing in Birmingham.
The abortion clinic.
That's right. Exactly. It was the abortion clinic, and ATF was all over Eric Rudolph. But the FBI, because the behavioral scientists said it had to be the guy who reported it, was, they got, their investigators took what was told by the behavioral scientists, says, well, here it is, let's just do it. And they ignored all the evidence that was right in front of them, and ignored the other.
An FBI agent recently said to me, God forbid you were the weird, helpful guy. Right after a crime's committed.
Very true. I mean, let's look at the Ramsey case. I mean, they went right after John and Patsy Ramsey, who I can sit here and unequivocally tell anybody who's listening they had nothing to do with it. And I've seen all the evidence in the case, but I will tell you now that they went after them because there was some training that said in 78% of the time or 83% of the time, the death of a child under the age of like 10 is a result of actions by the parents or something like that, and ignored all the physical evidence that was present. So this type of tool, the whole premise of eSleuth AI is to solve crime. That's the whole company's mantra. That's all they're interested in, is how do we solve crime? But it's a little bit more. It's to provide a tool to the investigator on the street. This is not for an analyst. This is not for a fusion center. This is not for a real-time crime center. This tool is strictly for the investigator on the field who catches that case, and or the DA's investigator who has to get this case to trial with the sole premise of solving the crime. That's all there is to it. And it's as simple as that.
Since you're familiar with it, taking the Ramsey case as an example, what if this kind of tool were available then, how could you imagine just sort of like practically using something like that?
Well, let me put it different. Okay, let me give you an example here. I'm not going to use the Ramsey case, but I'll use kind of a similar situation. You and I are partners, detectives. We find out a young lady has been raped and she's in the hospital. We show up at the scene of where the rape occurred. She's already been transported. She was found. Obvious rape has occurred. She was found unclothed in a park. They've already transferred her to the hospital. I fire up the system and I start, putting in a few little facts. I send you to the hospital. You go in to interview her. You're taking a picture of her face, just her face. You're looking at what her profession is. You're doing an interview of her. But while you're doing that, while I'm doing my piece, it's running in the background and it's checking the sex offender registry. It's checking every other sexual assault that it's looking at her profession. Wow, she was a nurse. She's a brunette. How many other sexual assaults or attempted sexual assaults of nurses have occurred in a geographic area? How many sexual assaults have occurred with nurses with blue eyes? How many have occurred?
linkage analysis essentially in the background while you're in ways that, let's say, the human mind may not even think of making links.
It does. It does it the way a seasoned investigator does it, but there's no link charts. We're not doing link charts. But it is looking at all that, and it's doing it in a second, and it's providing you with response saying, hey, there were 2 other sexual assaults of nurses with brown hair and blue eyes that occurred in the past 6 months. Boom. We have a sex offender who just got out of prison, and he'd been convicted for assaulting nurses. Why nurses? Well, his mother was a nurse, and she was a brunette. You know what I mean? But so it pulls all that stuff together. Now, it's the same thing that you and I would do manually, but it would take us 6 months to get through. And we might only hit about 40 to 50% of the information just because of human nature and the amount of time. This does it in a second or two. And on top of that is we have other cases coming in. So it basically processes and lets you move on to the next one very quickly. I gave an analogy. Somebody said, well, give me a quick analogy. I said, here's a quick analogy. You have the job of digging a swimming pool, and I hand you a shovel, and you have to dig an Olympic-sized swimming pool. After about an hour after you get started, I give you another swimming pool to dig. And then about a couple hours, I got another swimming pool to dig. And you're sitting there just shoveling as hard as you can. You're not getting anywhere. I'm walking in with the giant track hoe, and I'm scooping out a new swimming pool every 20 minutes. And now you can keep up. This is a tool that processes everything that you normally would do if you had unlimited time and unlimited resources. This is the equivalent of 100 assistants.
So, one of the things for me, like decades of research and social psychology and cognitive sciences have told us that confirmation as a bias is a huge problem for lay people. It's a huge problem for law enforcement. Just that the consequences of it in law enforcement, or even in a place like medicine, you could see the same thing. But the consequences of it in law enforcement are so huge because it can divert attention from the actual suspects. It can delay justice. It can harm, victims' families. It increases investigative costs. A focus long before AI was on the screen was for law enforcement to come up with decision-making models that really were evidence-based and could mitigate against some of these challenges. And it sounds like you guys are really trying to hit that on the head.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, what is your hope and your dream that would come out of all of this?
Listen, you're exactly right. My hope and my dream is quite simply this. I believe that this technology and the way we're building it, designing it, testing it, validating it will change the way law enforcement solves crime the way DNA and fingerprints did. The way fingerprints did in the 1890s, 1900s, the way DNA did back in the 70s and continues to do today. And I think that this technology is that next revolutionary step. Because what it will do is it allows police departments to take diminished and sometimes inexperienced resources and still address the violent crime in their communities at the same level as if they had unlimited resources and unlimited seasoned experience working it. And when you have a tool that can process monster amounts of data, find connections that humanly possible couldn't be found, and then present them to an investigator that says, here's your suspects, here's your witnesses, here's your defendants, and here's your addresses, and here's your residences, and then here's your probable cause to make an arrest, and does it in a matter of seconds, minutes, can look at your reports and say, wow, what the doctor is really saying is it a serrated knife with the 4-inch blade was used, and according to the medicological legal book that it translates all that. I think it's really gonna change the way we do a lot of things investigatively in this country, and I think my goal is to increase the clearance rate and reduce the crime rate. And it's as simple as that. Solve crime.
Yeah. I love this conversation. It combines like some of my favorite things, science, seeing the big picture, but also that idea of being able to use science and smart big picture thinking to actually help people and to improve society. So I love the idea of all those things coming together. And I also, there's a part of this where I really love the idea of like decreasing some of the disparities that we see from what citizens are able to receive from their police department simply based on the zip code that you live in, whether in what direction that is. So thanks, Scott. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll have you back sometime soon to see how things are going down the road into the next stage of the work that you're doing. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your interest in this. And I really appreciate it. I'd love to come back whenever you'd like. And what a great program, and I truly appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.